In 1980, archaeologists excavating a remote desert in northwestern China unearthed something that simply shouldn't exist. A perfectly preserved mummy with light brown hair, fine European features, and no genetic connection to any nearby population, buried 2,500 miles from the nearest European civilization, in a tomb dated to 1800 BCE. She had never been to Europe. Europe had never heard of her. And a 2021 DNA study confirmed she descended from a population so ancient and isolated that her lineage had diverged from all other known humans over 10,000 years before her birth. Her name is the Beauty of Lulan, and she is only the beginning of this story. What do you do when history doesn't fit the map? When mummies turn up in the wrong country, speaking the wrong language, wearing the wrong clothes, and nobody, for centuries, can explain why. For over 100 years, the Tocharians have been the great inconvenience of ancient history. A people European in appearance, Indo-European in language, yet living deep in Central Asia, building thriving cities along what would become the Silk Road thousands of years before anyone else dared try. They were erased so completely that we didn't even know they had a name until a German linguist found it scrawled on the wall of a cave in 1904. This is the story of the Tocharians, the forgotten people who built the first bridge between East and West, shaped the Buddhism practiced across 1 billion lives today, and vanished so thoroughly that the world spent centuries pretending they never existed. To understand the Tocharians, we need to travel back to a world that looks almost nothing like our own. It is roughly 2100 BCE. The Bronze Age is in full flourish. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom are consolidating power along the Nile. In Mesopotamia, the city of Ur still stands as one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. In the Aegean, the Minoan civilization is building its palace at Knossos. And on the vast grasslands stretching from modern Ukraine east to the Altai Mountains, the Eurasian steppe, something is happening that will quietly reshape the genetic and linguistic map of the entire planet. A culture archaeologists call the Afanasevo is expanding eastward out of the Siberian steppe. Closely related to the Yamnaya, the cattle-herding, horse-taming pastoralists who would later seed virtually every branch of the Indo-European language family across Europe and South Asia, the Afanasevo people were moving in a direction no one else was moving, not west toward Europe, not south toward Persia or India. East. Into the rising sun, across the Ural Mountains, across the Siberian grasslands, and eventually into the forbidding heart of Central Asia. By around 2000 BCE, their descendants had arrived at the edge of one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Tarim Basin sits in what is today the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of northwestern China. It is enormous, roughly the size of Western Europe, and dominated at its center by the Taklamakan Desert. The name translates in the local Uyghur language as the place of ruins, and some sources render it more ominously as you go in, you don't come out. Summer temperatures in its interior exceed 40 degrees Celsius. Annual rainfall in some areas measures less than 10 millimeters. Vast seas of sand dunes bury whatever cities and roads foolish enough to be built within reach. But the Tarim Basin has edges. Ringing its interior are some of the world's great mountain ranges, the Kunlun to the south, the Tian Shan to the north, the Pamirs to the west. And from those mountains, glacial meltwater streams down to form a necklace of oases along the basin's outer fringe. Green pockets of life in a dead sea of sand, fertile enough to graze cattle, fertile enough to grow crops, fertile enough to build a civilization. It was into these oases, places like Lulan, Nia, Kucha, Turfan, and Cotton, that the ancestors of the Tocharians moved. And here, cut off from the wider world by mountains and desert on every side, they remained. For centuries, for millennia, building a culture that preserved the most archaic features of their steppe homeland, borrowing almost nothing from the neighboring Chinese civilization to the east or the Iranian world to the west. That isolation would become the key to unlocking one of history's most baffling linguistic mysteries. The Tocharian language is a paradox that kept linguists awake for decades. When German philologist Friedrich Wilhelm Karl Müller first identified the Tocharian script in manuscripts recovered from cave sites along the Silk Road in 1904, he made an immediate and astonishing observation. This language, spoken in Central Asia, closer geographically to Beijing than to Rome, was a centum language. This single classification upended everything scholars thought they knew about Indo-European language geography. To understand why, a brief detour into linguistics is essential. The Indo-European language family splits into two major branches based on how they treated a specific sound inherited from the Proto-Indo-European ancestor language. The centum languages, Latin, Greek, Celtic, Germanic, kept the sound as a hard K. The satem languages, Persian, Sanskrit, the Slavic tongues, changed it into a sibilant. Geographically, the centum languages cluster in the west, the satem languages in the east and south. Every Indo-European language found between the Tocharian homeland and Europe is satem. Persian, spoken just a few hundred miles west of Tocharian territory. Sanskrit, spoken to the south. All satem. By every rule of geography and population movement, Tocharian should have been satem too. Instead, it was unmistakably centum, more closely related to ancient Latin and archaic Gaelic than to the Persian spoken just over the mountains from where it was actually used. The explanation, once linguists worked it out, was elegant. The Tocharians had left the Indo-European homeland so early, before the centum-satem split had fully developed, and had moved so fast across the steppe that they bypassed all the populations who would later become satem speakers. They were the earliest migrants, carrying the oldest form of the ancestral language with them into isolation, where it was preserved, like a fly in amber, for thousands of years. Tocharian survived in two dialects. Tocharian A, sometimes called Turfanian or East Tocharian, was spoken in the oasis cities of Turfan and Karashar in the eastern Tarim. Tocharian B, known as Kuchian or West Tocharian, was spoken further west, centered on the great city of Kucha. Both dialects are attested in thousands of manuscripts discovered in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by European expedition teams. Buddhist texts, commercial contracts, caravan passes, medical manuals, love poems. Together, they reveal a sophisticated, literate, and deeply cultured society. By around 500 BCE, the Tocharian oasis kingdoms were established urban communities with regional political authority and long-distance trade connections. Kucha, known in Chinese sources as Kyusai, had grown into a city of tens of thousands. It was famous, above all, for its music. Tang Dynasty Chinese sources from the 7th century CE describe the Kuchian musical style as one of the most celebrated in the known world, a sound so distinctive that it transformed Chinese court music for generations, introducing new instruments, new modes, new rhythms that echoed across East Asia. The biwa, the lute at the heart of classical Japanese music, descends in part from a Kuchian instrument. The Tocharian oases also became the first reliable waypoints in trans-Eurasian trade, operating functional trade networks across Central Asia, a full 5 centuries before the Han Emperor Wu Dai officially opened the Silk Road in 130 BCE. When Chinese merchants first began probing west in the 2nd century BCE, they were following tracks the Tocharians had already worn into the desert sand for generations, and the dead were keeping their secrets. Same dry, cold, alkaline conditions that made the Tarim Basin so hostile to life made it extraordinarily hospitable to preservation. Beginning in the 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, Chinese archaeologists began uncovering hundreds of naturally mummified bodies from the desert margins. Mummies so well preserved that their hair color, facial structure, clothing, and sometimes even tattoos remained perfectly intact after 3,000 to 4,000 years. The most celebrated is the Beauty of Lulan, excavated in 1980 near the ruins of the ancient city of Lulan in the eastern Tarim. She dates to approximately 1800 BCE and died around age 45. Her hair is light brown. Her features are distinctly non-East Asian. She wears a felt hat adorned with feathers. At the time of her discovery, Chinese authorities were not eager to publicize what she looked like, and what she looked like was European. Even more arresting was the Churchin man, found in 1985 near the modern town of Charchin in the southern Tarim. He dates to approximately 1000 BCE and stands, even in death, at roughly 6 feet 6 inches, a stature that would have been extraordinary in the ancient world by any standard. His hair is reddish-brown, his beard is full, and his clothing, elaborately preserved woolen garments in multiple layers, stopped textile historians cold. The weaving technique was virtually identical to Bronze Age Celtic and early Germanic textile traditions from contemporaneous sites in Central Europe, including tartan-style plaid patterning that nobody expected to find 3,000 miles east of Scotland. For decades, access to the mummies and their genetic data was tightly controlled. The political sensitivity was obvious. The Tarim Basin is the ancestral homeland of the Uyghur people, a Turkic Muslim minority whose relationship with Chinese state authority has been, to put it diplomatically, deeply fraught. The existence of a founding population in that region that was physically and genetically non-Chinese, present for 2,000 years before Chinese political authority arrived, was not a narrative the state was eager to amplify. International pressure mounted throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Partial genetic studies trickled out. A 2010 paper in BMC Biology confirmed the mummies showed predominantly Western Eurasian ancestry with minimal East Asian admixture. It was significant, but incomplete. Then, in October 2021, the definitive study arrived. Published in Nature, and led by a multinational team including researchers from Harvard Medical School, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, and Chinese institutions, the study analyzed ancient DNA from 13 of the oldest Tarim Basin mummies, including individuals from the Zio cemetery dating to approximately 1800 BCE. The findings shattered existing models. Tarim mummies were not, as many had theorized, a mixed Bronze Age population that had picked up diverse genetic ancestry while migrating from the West. They were not Yamna settlers who had mixed with Iranian farmers or a blend of Eurasian steppe peoples. Instead, they were the descendants of a single, ancient, extraordinarily isolated population, one with its deepest genetic roots in the ancient North Eurasian lineage, associated with the Afanasevo culture of Siberia and the Altai region. Their divergence from all other known populations was estimated at somewhere between 10,000 and 7,000 years before the oldest mummies were buried. They had arrived in the Tarim Basin in the Bronze Age, and for approximately 1,500 years they had barely mixed with anyone, not with East Asians, not with Iranian farmers from the West, not with South Asian populations to the south. They had remained, in the researchers' words, a highly isolated population, a genetic island in the middle of the ancient world's most heavily trafficked crossroads. This finding reframes everything. While the pyramids of Giza were rising, while the cities of the Indus Valley were flourishing at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, while the earliest Chinese civilization was taking shape along the Yellow River, the Proto-Tocharians sat in their desert oases and talked to almost no one. They preserved a genome, and with it a language that was like a message in a bottle from the very earliest days of human prehistory. But isolation, however remarkable, cannot last forever. By the first millennium CE, the world outside the Tarim Basin was moving too fast. From the east, the Han Chinese Empire had been pressing into Central Asia since the 2nd century BCE. Protectorate of the Western regions, established in 60 BCE, made nominal vassals of the Tocharian city kingdoms. Trade brought wealth, but it also brought dependency. From the west, Sogdian merchants, the great commercial middlemen of the ancient world operating out of cities like Samarkand, were increasingly taking over the most profitable Silk Road routes. And from the north, successive nomadic confederacies were reshaping the steppe. The Xiongnu, then the Rouran, then the western Gurktuks. The Tocharians adapted. They became devoted patrons of Buddhism, which arrived in the Tarim Basin from India via the Kushan Empire around the 1st century CE and found fertile ground in the oasis cities. The cave paintings at Kizil near Kucha, dating from the 3rd to 8th century CE, show Tocharian donors in distinctly Iranian-style dress, with reddish-brown hair and light eyes, attending Buddhist scenes painted in a style that blends Indian, Iranian, and Chinese influences. They are some of the most stunning artworks of the ancient Silk Road. And out of this Buddhist Tocharian world came one of the most influential figures in the history of religion. Kumaragava was born in Kucha around 344 CE. His father, Kumaryana, was an Indian Buddhist monk from a noble family in Kashmir who had traveled to Kucha and there married the Kuchian princess Jiva, a woman of Tocharian descent, the sister of the king. Kumaragava was therefore half Indian, half Tocharian, a living embodiment of the Silk Road's cultural crossroads. He was recognized as a prodigy almost from birth. By age 7, he had memorized thousands of verses of Buddhist scripture. By his early 20s, he was famous across Central Asia as a master of both Hinayana and Mahayana Buddhist doctrine. In 383 CE, the Chinese warlord Lu Guang invaded Kucha specifically to capture Kumaragava and bring this famous monk back to the Chinese world. Kumaragava spent nearly 2 decades in political captivity in the northwestern Chinese territories before finally reaching the capital Chang'an in 401 CE. What followed was one of the great translation projects in human history. Working under the patronage of Emperor Yao Xing of the later Qin dynasty, surrounded by a team of hundreds of Chinese monks, Kumaragava translated over 300 Buddhist scriptures from Sanskrit into Chinese between 401 and his death in 413 CE. Among them, the Diamond Sutra, the Amitabha Sutra, the Vimalakirti Sutra, and the Lotus Sutra, perhaps the single most important text in East Asian Buddhism. His translations were not merely technically competent. They were literary masterpieces that transformed Chinese prose, introduced new vocabulary, and shaped how the Chinese-speaking world understood the nature of mind, suffering, and liberation. Scholars of Buddhism routinely describe his work as the foundation upon which virtually all of East Asian Buddhist practice is built. The Buddhism of China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, the faith of hundreds of millions of people over 16 centuries, was filtered in profound ways through the mind of a half-Tocharian man from a city in the desert. In 644 CE, Tang dynasty forces under the great general and viceroy Hu Junji conquered the eastern Tocharian city of Turfan. 4 years later, in 648 CE, the Tang general Ashina Shir, himself a Gurktuok prince serving the Chinese emperor, captured Kucha. The Tocharian kingdoms became administrative units of the Tang Empire's western regions. For another 2 centuries, Tocharian continued to be spoken in the oases, but the political context had shifted irreversibly. Then in 840 CE, the Uyghur Khaganate, which had dominated the Mongolian steppe since the mid-8th century, collapsed under Yenisei Kyrgyz attack, sending hundreds of thousands of Uyghur Turks flooding southward and westward into the Tarim Basin. Over the following century and a half, the Tocharian-speaking populations were absorbed into the expanding Uyghur culture, linguistically, culturally, and eventually genetically. By approximately 1000 CE, no living person spoke Tocharian. The language had no descendants. It left no daughter tongues, no Creole, no patois. It survived only in manuscripts that had been sealed in desert caves and buried under sand, manuscripts that would wait in darkness for 900 years. The recovery of those manuscripts is itself an extraordinary story. Beginning in the 1890s, a series of European expeditions descended on the Silk Road cave sites with mixed motives, scholarly, imperial, and frankly predatory. The most systematic was Sir Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist who conducted 4 expeditions through Central Asia between 1900 and 1930. At sites like Dunhuang and Cotton, Stein acquired tens of thousands of manuscripts, textiles, wall paintings, and artifacts, many of which ended up in the British Museum and the Indian Museum in Kolkata, a removal of cultural heritage that remains controversial today. German expeditions led by Albert Grunwedel and Albert von Lecoq between 1902 and 1914 removed vast sections of wall paintings from Kizil and other Kuchian cave sites, paintings that are now in the Berlin Ethnological Museum, separated from their context by 12,000 kilometers and a century of history. From these materials, Friedrich Müller's 1904 identification of the Tocharian language set off decades of painstaking linguistic reconstruction. Emil Sieg and Wilhelm Siegling produced the first systematic grammar of Tocharian in 1931. It took the combined effort of some of the 20th century's greatest historical linguists, including Georges Jean Pinault, Werner Winter, and Don Ring, to fully document and analyze what the Tocharians had left behind. And what they left behind matters enormously. Genetically, the 2021 Nature study reshaped our understanding of Bronze Age migration across Eurasia. The Tocharians were not the end product of gradual population mixing. They were the frozen remnant of an early Indo-European migration, preserved in genetic amber by geographic isolation. Every model of ancient human movement across the Eurasian continent now has to account for them, an isolated population sitting, invisibly, at the center of it all for millennia. Linguistically, Tocharian is one of the most important witnesses to the reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the ancestral tongue from which Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Persian, Russian, English, and more than 400 other living languages ultimately descend. Because Tocharian preserved such archaic features in such isolation, it provides evidence about the earliest stage of the Indo-European language family that no other surviving language can offer. When linguists argue about what the original word for wheel, or sky, or fire sounded like 10,000 years ago, Tocharian has a vote. Culturally, the Tocharian oasis cities were the infrastructure of connectivity, the original nodes of what would become the world's most consequential trade network. The Silk Road did not spring into existence in 130 BCE because a Chinese emperor decided to open it. It followed routes that Tocharian merchants, pastoralists, and city builders had already made viable over the preceding 2,000 years. The wells were already dug. The caravanserai had already been established. The relationships with local populations had already been built. And then there is the political dimension, the one that kept the mummies locked in restricted museums and the genetic data unpublished for decades. The Tarim Basin today is the site of one of the world's most scrutinized political situations. The Uyghur people, whose Turkic-speaking ancestors absorbed the Tocharians 1,000 years ago, have faced severe repression under Chinese state authority, including mass detentions that international bodies have described as crimes against humanity. The history of the Tarim Basin, including who was there first and when and why, is not abstract scholarship. It is contested ground. The Tocharian story does not resolve that conflict. History rarely settles the arguments of the present, but it does complicate any claim to simple, linear historical ownership of the land. The Tarim Basin has been home to ancient North Eurasians, to Indo-European-speaking Tocharians, to Iranian-speaking Saka traders, to Sogdian merchants, to Tibetan soldiers, to Han Chinese administrators, to Uyghur Turks, and layer upon layer, millennium upon millennium. Civilizations do not have clear titles of deed. They have only the traces they leave and the questions those traces force us to ask. If stories like this, the ones that fall through the cracks of the textbooks, the civilizations that shaped everything and got credited with nothing, if those are the stories you want more of, then this channel exists for you. Every week, we pull another piece of the forgotten world back into the light. The erased, the overlooked, the deliberately buried. Subscribe now and let's keep uncovering what history tried to leave in the sand. Here is what the Tocharians leave us with, 4,000 years on. A people can be extraordinary and still disappear. Influence doesn't guarantee memory. The woman buried in the Lulan Desert in 1800 BCE, the one with the light brown hair and the felt hat with feathers, she had no way of knowing that the trading routes running past her oasis would one day carry silk and horses and ideas and religions across the known world. She didn't know she was standing at a crossroads of civilizations. She was just living her life in the only home her people had ever known. The lesson of the Tocharians is not about conquest. It's not about empire. It's about connectivity, about what happens when peoples who have been isolated find each other, begin to trade, begin to exchange not just goods but beliefs and languages and genes. The world as we know it was not built by the great empires alone. It was built in the spaces between them by the people history forgot to name. They were the blue-eyed mystery of the Silk Road, a genetic time capsule from the first chapter of human prehistory. The half-forgotten ancestors of a monk who taught 1 billion people how to think about the nature of mind. The pioneers of the road that connected the ancient world. Their language is dead. Their cities are dust. Their genes, diluted by 1,000 years of history, survive in populations across Central Asia who may have no idea what they carry. But we know their name now. And knowing their name, we can begin to understand what they built and what we owe them for building it. SEOTAGS. Ancient history, Tocharians, Tarim mummies, Silk Road history, lost civilization, Bronze Age migration, Indo-European languages, historical mystery, archaeology, ancient DNA, forgotten empire, China ancient history, Central Asia history, historical documentary, blue-eyed mummies description. Deep in the Tarim Basin of northwestern China, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of perfectly preserved mummies dating back 4,000 years, with light hair, European features, and no genetic connection to any neighboring population. These were the Tocharians, the forgotten Bronze Age people who pioneered the Silk Road, shaped East Asian Buddhism, and then vanished so completely that the world forgot they ever existed. In this documentary, we trace the full story of the Tocharians, from their origins on the Eurasian steppe 4,000 years ago, to their remarkable oasis civilization in the Tarim Basin, to the 2021 DNA study that finally answered who they really were. We explore how a half-Tocharian monk named Kumaragava shaped the Buddhism practiced by 1 billion people today, and why China spent decades restricting access to the mummies and their genetic data. This is ancient history, archaeology, and a mystery that touches some of the most contested ground on Earth. Timestamps 000 Hook. The mummy that shouldn't exist 045, the Bronze Age world before the Silk Road 430, the Tocharian language mystery 715, the mummies and the DNA evidence 1000, Kumaragava and the Buddhist legacy 1230, why history forgot them, and why it matters ancient history lost civilization Silk Road archaeology historicomistery.